Was the funniest man I knew who wasn't supposed to be funny. And he would be funny doing and saying nothing.
For decades, fans have whispered about the deep, unspoken bond between Angie Dickinson and Dean Martin, a connection so warm, so natural, that many believed it had to be more than friendship. Hollywood insiders claimed they saw sparks. Co-stars felt an undeniable chemistry. And audiences, they could feel it through the screen. But for years, Angie kept quiet, choosing grace, choosing privacy, and choosing to protect a man she cared for deeply. But now, after all this time, Angie Dickinson has finally decided to speak up, and what she's revealing about Dean Martin is something no one expected. This isn't just another Hollywood love story. It's a story about loyalty, heartbreak, admiration, and truths she kept locked away for decades out of respect for Dean. Angie describes a side of Martin that few ever saw, the private man behind the effortless charm, the smooth voice, and the playful smile. She talks about his loneliness, his quiet suffering, and why he pushed certain people away even when he needed them the most. She reveals the real reason their relationship remained undefined, why she turned down moments that could have changed everything, and the heartbreaking confession Dean made to her during one of the darkest chapters of his life. This is Angie's story, finally told in her own words, and it paints a picture of Dean Martin that is raw, vulnerable, and more emotional than fans ever imagined. Angie Dickinson's connection with Dean Martin didn't begin with romance, rumors, or Hollywood gossip. It began with something far simpler: respect. When the two first crossed paths in the golden era of television variety shows and glamorous Las Vegas nights, Angie was already making a name for herself as a rising actress, while Dean Martin was one of the most recognizable entertainers in the world. Yet Angie always said that what struck her most about Dean wasn't the fame, the charm, or the effortless cool he displayed. It was how gentle he was. She recalled their first conversation as easy. The way talking to Dean felt like reconnecting with a friend she had known for years. He had a way of disarming people, making them feel seen, valued, and comfortable. Angie admired that. She often said Dean possessed a kind of emotional warmth that Hollywood rarely rewarded, and even more rarely preserved. As their friendship grew, so did the speculation. Dean Martin was known for his on-screen flirtations and his off-camera charisma, and Angie Dickinson was one of the most admired actresses of her generation. Together, they created an energy that was impossible to ignore. Every time they appeared at the same event, rumors spread like wildfire. But Angie, at the time, remained dismissive of all the attention behind the scenes. Their bond grew in ways outsiders didn't understand. Angie described Dean as a man who carried more weight on his shoulders than anyone ever realized. Despite his public image as the carefree, joking, effortlessly cool member of the Rat Pack, Dean was far more complex. Angie would often see glimpses of the emotional exhaustion behind his laugh. She noticed the way he'd sometimes drift off into silence, how his eyes dimmed when certain memories surfaced, and how he avoided talking about personal pain unless he trusted the person deeply. It was during these quiet, private moments that Angie saw the real Dean Martin, a man who loved fiercely, who felt deeply, and who often covered his heart with humor so no one could see the wounds underneath. She once said that Dean told the truth in ways that didn't feel heavy, meaning he could open up without ever making the moment feel bleak. But when he did share something personal, it was unforgettable. One evening, after a long night of filming, Angie and Dean found themselves alone on a set that had grown still. Dean had been quieter than usual that day, and Angie sensed that something was weighing on him. When she gently asked if he was all right, Dean simply smiled and admitted that he didn't like people worrying about him. But then he shared something that stayed with her for decades. "Sometimes the hardest part isn't being alone," he said. "It's knowing people think you never are." That one sentence revealed the truth of his inner life, a life filled with expectations, pressure, and the constant need to be the charming entertainer the world adored. Angie later said that moment changed the way she looked at him forever. It made her understand why Dean struggled with deep emotional attachments, why he avoided drama, and why he kept his heart guarded even with the people he trusted. And as their friendship continued, Angie began to realize that Dean Martin was a man who desperately needed peace. He longed for simplicity, for quiet, for connection without chaos. Yet the world around him demanded the opposite: the spotlight, the laughter, the performance. Angie stepped into his life as a source of calm, someone who didn't expect him to be Dean Martin, but simply a man trying to navigate fame without losing himself. What Angie didn't know then was that this gentle role she played in his life would later become the reason she kept silent for so many years. She wasn't protecting a secret scandal. She was protecting a man she cared for deeply. As Angie Dickinson and Dean Martin grew closer, their connection shifted into something far deeper than Hollywood friendships usually allowed. Angie often described Dean as a man who understood her in ways others never tried to. Despite their glamorous careers, both carried a quiet loneliness that fame couldn't erase. They recognized it in each other instantly, and that unspoken understanding created a bond neither could deny. Angie later admitted that she wasn't prepared for how gentle Dean could be behind all the playful humor. He had a remarkable ability to make her feel safe, both emotionally and professionally. At a time when many women in Hollywood were pressured to conform or stay silent, Dean encouraged Angie to speak her mind. He treated her as an equal, which in those days was rare. Yet the world around them refused to see their friendship as just that. Every glance, every laugh they shared off camera became fuel for endless rumors. Gossip magazines loved pairing Dean with any woman he stood next to, but with Angie, the speculation reached another level. Some claimed they were secretly dating. Others insisted they were engaged in a passionate affair. A few said they were simply inseparable. Angie, however, stayed quiet through it all, but not because she wanted to protect her own reputation. She was protecting Dean. He didn't need more pressure, she later revealed. He needed peace. Dean had already endured more than the public ever knew. His personal life had been marked by heartbreak, failed relationships, and overwhelming expectations placed on him by fans who believed he was always relaxed and in control. But Angie knew the truth. Dean carried more emotional scars than he let on. He faced inner battles silently, not wanting to burden anyone. She recalled one particular night when Dean invited her to a small gathering at his home. The usual crowd wasn't there, no loud rat-pack jokes, no audience to entertain. It was a quiet evening with just a few close friends. Dean spent most of the night talking softly, sharing stories Angie had never heard before. He opened up about moments in his life that had shaken him, losses that haunted him, regrets he never spoke of publicly, and the heavy weight of fame that often made him feel trapped. Angie later said it was one of the first times she truly saw Dean's vulnerability. He was honest, reflective, and painfully human. She sat through the entire conversation without interrupting, listening as Dean revealed the emotional truths he never allowed the cameras to see. She realized then that he trusted her with a part of himself he rarely shared. From that night on, Angie became a quiet anchor in Dean's life. She didn't try to fix him, advise him, or challenge him. She simply offered presence, something Dean desperately needed. Their bond grew stronger, built not on romance or flirtation, but on mutual respect and emotional refuge. Dean could be himself with her, completely unguarded, and Angie considered that a privilege still. The rumors persisted. Studios whispered. Tabloids printed stories. Fans speculated endlessly. But Angie refused to feed the gossip. She understood better than anyone that Dean valued privacy above all else, and she wasn't about to break that trust. Even when people questioned her motives or suggested she was hiding something scandalous over time, this protective silence became one of the reasons people suspected there was more between them. Why would Angie Dickinson, one of Hollywood's most outspoken actresses, stay quiet about Dean Martin unless there was a secret worth hiding? What no one realized was that Angie wasn't hiding a scandal. She was guarding a friendship that meant more to her than fame ever could. In fact, she believed that talking about Dean's inner struggles publicly would have hurt him more than any rumor. She admired him too much to let that happen, so she endured the gossip and kept the truth tucked away, not because she was afraid, but because she cared. It wasn't until decades later, long after Dean had passed, that Angie finally felt ready to speak. And when she did, the truth she revealed was far more heartbreaking and far more beautiful than anyone had expected. As years passed, The bond between Angie Dickinson and Dean Martin evolved into something that even they struggled to define. They were not lovers in the traditional sense, nor were they simply colleagues. Their relationship lived in a quiet space between emotional honesty and unspoken boundaries, a space both of them respected but never tried to label. Angie later said that what she and Dean shared didn't need a name, because naming it would have only complicated something naturally beautiful. Dean, despite his confident public persona, often leaned on Angie during moments of deep personal struggle. Behind the smooth voice and effortless charm was a man who had experienced profound grief, especially after tragedies within his family. Those who knew him understood that Dean rarely let anyone too close emotionally. He hid behind humor, behind his easygoing nature, behind his reputation as the man who never took life too seriously. But Angie saw through all of that. There were nights when Dean would quietly call Angie, not to talk about work, but simply because he didn't want to sit alone in silence. He trusted her presence more than anything. Angie remembered how Dean would pour a drink, sit back, and talk about his fears. Fears that fame had created, fears that aging intensified, and fears that loneliness made impossible to ignore. She became, in many ways, the person he confided in when the world felt too heavy. Yet for all that closeness, both Angie and Dean made a deliberate decision to keep their relationship discreet. Dean, especially, was wary of the headlines that would surely follow. He didn't want Angie dragged into the chaos of tabloid speculation. He didn't want studios or agents to twist their friendship into something marketable. And he didn't want his personal pain to become entertainment. Angie respected that deeply, even when it forced her into silence. There were moments, however, when Angie wished things had been different. In rare interviews, she hinted that timing played a cruel role in their connection. She admired Dean's kindness, his loyalty, and the way he could make her laugh even on her worst days. But she also recognized that Dean's emotional wounds ran deeper than she could ever reach. She knew that stepping into a romantic relationship with him would have required him to reveal parts of himself he wasn't ready to confront. So she chose to love him quietly, without claiming him. Their chemistry on screen only fueled more rumors. Directors noticed the natural rhythm they shared. Co-stars saw the way they could communicate without speaking. Even audience members wrote letters saying they believed Dean and Angie were perfect for each other. But behind the scenes, Angie kept her heart carefully balanced, close enough to support Dean, yet distant enough not to overwhelm him. One of the most emotional memories Angie shared was from a night when Dean seemed especially troubled. He spoke about feeling tired, not physically, but emotionally. The constant pressure to entertain, the expectations from fans, and the unresolved grief he carried became too much for him. Angie stayed by his side, listening as he admitted he no longer recognized the man the public adored. He confessed that the world saw a version of him that wasn't real, and that pretending had become exhausting. Angie later said that moment broke her heart, because she realized Dean spent much of his life trying to protect everyone except himself. She held his hand that night, offering comfort without judgment, knowing it was all he needed. As Dean grew older, Angie watched him withdraw further from Hollywood. He chose quieter days, smaller circles, and fewer public appearances. She respected his decision, knowing he deserved peace after a lifetime of giving so much of himself to others. Even when they weren't together, their connection never faded. They checked on each other, shared memories, and held on to a friendship that had survived decades of misunderstanding from the outside world. Angie carried those memories with her long after Dean's passing, and when she finally spoke publicly, she didn't share scandal, she shared truth. A truth shaped by compassion, loyalty, and an emotional bond that outlasted Hollywood's noise. When Angie Dickinson finally chose to speak openly about Dean Martin, it wasn't to stir controversy or revive old gossip. It was to honor a man who had shaped her life in ways she never fully acknowledged. While he was alive, she wanted people to understand the real Dean, the one behind the Hollywood spotlight, the one the world admired but never truly knew. And as she shared her memories, her voice carried both warmth and heartbreak, revealing just how deeply Dean had impacted her life. Angie began by explaining that Dean Martin was one of the few people in Hollywood who treated her with unwavering respect from the very beginning. At a time when the industry often viewed women through a narrow lens, Dean saw her talent, her intelligence, and her worth. He championed her when others doubted her, and he trusted her instincts when many dismissed her ideas. That support, gentle, sincere, and never self-serving, left an imprint on her that lasted decades. She also spoke about how Dean's effortless charisma wasn't an act. He truly enjoyed making people laugh, making them feel seen, and easing tension whenever he could. But beneath that humor was a man who carried emotional burdens heavily. Angie revealed that Dean's grief, especially after losing someone close, never fully healed. He masked his sadness with charm. He hid his loneliness behind jokes, and he pushed through pain with a smile the world believed was real. What touched Angie most, she said, was Dean's ability to love quietly. He didn't boast, he didn't demand attention, and he didn't make grand gestures. His affection was calm, steady, and sincere. And though the world believed they were romantically involved, Angie clarified that what they shared was something much deeper than a typical love affair. It was a connection built on vulnerability, respect, and emotional refuge. They understood each other in a way that didn't require labels, and that made their relationship even more meaningful. One of the revelations that surprised fans most was Angie's admission about a conversation she and Dean had shortly before his most difficult years. Dean confided that he feared being forgotten, not as a performer, but as a person. He worried that beneath the fame, there wasn't much left of the real him. Angie remembered reassuring him that he had already touched countless lives, including hers, in ways he couldn't imagine. She told him that his legacy wasn't in the songs, the movies, or the comedy. It was in the kindness he showed privately, away from cameras. Angie also shared the heartbreaking truth that after Dean withdrew from public life, she tried to remain in contact, knowing how isolating that transition could be for someone who had lived in the spotlight for so long. Sometimes Dean responded warmly, other times he was distant. Angie believed it wasn't personal. It was simply Dean trying to cope with the weight of grief and the pressure of being Dean Martin. Even when he no longer wanted the world's attention, when Dean passed away, Angie said she felt a loss that went beyond friendship. She felt as if a chapter of her life, one filled with laughter, trust, and unspoken understanding, had quietly closed forever. She carried his memories privately for years, holding onto the moments he shared only with her, believing that protecting his dignity was the last gift she could give him. But as time passed and people continued to speculate about their relationship, Angie realized that staying silent wasn't protecting Dean anymore. It was keeping the world from knowing a man who deserved to be remembered for his humanity, not just his fame. So she finally spoke, revealing not scandal but truth. And the truth was that Dean Martin was far more fragile, far more loving, and far more genuine than the world ever knew. By sharing her story, Angie hoped people would see the man behind the legend, a man who struggled, who loved deeply, and who found comfort in a friendship that didn't need a title. Her words offered closure, not only for herself but for fans who always sensed there was more to their bond. And in the end, Angie Dickinson's tribute became one of the most heartfelt testaments to Dean Martin's life, a reminder that some connections are too profound to fade, even with time.